Imagine a fighter so advanced that even Allied pilots called it a miracle of engineering. It could outrun nearly every aircraft in the sky. Its climb rate was astonishing. Its sleek lines made it look like something from the future. And yet, for most of the men who strapped into it, this so-called miracle became a death sentence. Because Germany's last desperate gamble, its revolutionary jet fighters were often more dangerous to their own pilots than to the enemy. Tonight, we're uncovering the story of the jet that looked unstoppable but was so flawed that even its creators feared it. A weapon born out of desperation, fueled by propaganda, and flown by pilots who rarely survived to tell the tale. By 1944, Germany was in crisis. The Third Reich, that once seemed unstoppable, was now collapsing under the weight of endless fronts. The Red Army pushed relentlessly from the east. The Allies bombed cities daily from the west. Entire towns lay in ruins. Factories were being flattened. Oil supplies were dwindling. And the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was being shredded in the skies. Germany had no answer for the thousands of American B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds flying daylight raids, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. Every month, hundreds of German fighters were shot down. The once proud Luftwaffe aces were now hopelessly outnumbered, watching their skies vanish. Hitler's solution, a miracle weapon. A machine so advanced, so terrifying, that it would force the Allies to hesitate, maybe even to sue for peace. And for Hitler, that miracle would come from the air. He demanded jets fast, invincible jets that would change the war overnight. But here's the twist. While German engineers were indeed designing revolutionary aircraft, their greatest obstacle wasn't always the Allies. It was their own leadership. Take the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It could reach speeds of nearly 550 miles per hour, over 100, faster than most Allied fighters. Yet, because of Hitler's obsession with turning it into a bomber, production was delayed for months. Politics and infighting crippled progress. What could have been Germany's best chance at a technological breakthrough was already sabotaged by confusion at the top. And then came the even stranger request, a people's fighter. Hitler wanted a jet so cheap, so easy to build, that it could be flown by teenagers, a jet that could be mass-produced in wooden workshops and hidden factories. The result, a machine so rushed and reckless that it turned into one of the deadliest cockpits in history, not for the enemy, but for its own pilots. But we'll get to that disaster in a moment. What kind of nation put schoolboys in the cockpit of a jet? By the winter of 1944, that's exactly what Germany was planning. The jet was called the Heinkel, He-162, though its propaganda name was far more telling, Volksjäger. Translated, it meant the people's fighter. But here's the irony. This people's fighter wasn't designed to save the German people. It was designed to save Hitler's pride. By late 1944, Hitler demanded a miracle. With Allied forces advancing on all fronts, the Reich needed something dramatic, something to frighten the world into hesitation. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised the Führer a cheap, mass-producible jet that could flood the skies. The requirements bordered on insanity. It had to be ready in 3 months. It had to be so simple that Hitler youth boys barely trained to drive a car could fly it. It had to be made largely of wood, since aluminum supplies were gone. And it had to hit speeds of over 500 miles per hour. Heinkel engineers sketched the He 162 inches, just 72 hours. The prototype rolled out within weeks. It was sleek, compact, and undeniably futuristic, the kind of plane that looked more like something from the jet age of the 1,950 seconds than the battlefields of 1,944. But speed came at a cost. Corners were cut everywhere. The wooden wings were poorly bonded, often snapping mid-flight. The engine, perched dangerously above the fuselage, sucked in debris and often flamed out. The landing gear was fragile, prone to collapse even on smooth runways. Still, to German propaganda, it was a miracle fighter. Posters hailed it as the machine that would sweep Allied bombers from the skies. In reality, it was a coffin waiting for its next victim. During its first public demonstration in December 1944, tragedy struck. A highly experienced test pilot, Captain Gotthold Peter, took the He-162 into the air. At first, it looked flawless, sleek lines, rapid climb, astonishing speed. Crowds of Luftwaffe officers applauded. And then, disaster. The right wing simply tore away from the fuselage. The jet spiraled, broke apart, and slammed into the ground in front of the watching crowd. The truth was revealed in the wreckage. Glue shortages had forced factories to use inferior bonding agents on the wooden wings. Heat, stress, and vibration had literally ripped the aircraft apart. This was the jet Hitler wanted to arm teenagers with, churned out He-162 seconds. Training was another matter. By 1945, Germany had lost thousands of experienced pilots. Instead, Hitler Youth boys of 16, sometimes younger, were trained to fly these jets in a matter of hours. Some had never even flown a propeller plane before stepping into the cockpit of a jet that could exceed 500 miles per hour. Imagine the terror. You're a teenager. The Reich tells you that you're defending your homeland. They strap you into a wooden death trap, and they tell you to face veteran American and British pilots who've been fighting since 1940. For many, the flight lasted only minutes. In propaganda reels, the He-162 was hailed as a miracle plane. Nazi newsreels showed formations of jets soaring confidently through the clouds, but the pilots knew the truth. Many called it a gefährliches Spielzeug, a dangerous toy. Others refused outright to fly it, preferring the relative safety of prison to the certainty of death in the air. Reports from Luftwaffe units revealed chilling statistics. Far more He-162 seconds were lost to crashes and mechanical failures than to enemy fire. One German mechanic even admitted after the war, for the few who survived takeoff, the psychological toll was immense. Pilots reported violent vibration in the cockpit. Controls were overly sensitive, sometimes reacting so sharply that the aircraft tumbled out of control. Others recalled the heat from the engine above, searing the cockpit, or debris being sucked into the intake and exploding mid-flight. Some young pilots never even left the ground. They froze on the runway, refusing to advance the throttle. Their officers had to drag them out and force another cadet in. This wasn't a weapon of war. It was a weapon of despair. On paper, the He-162 was a marvel. In the air, it was a coffin with wings. The Reich called it a miracle jet. The propaganda reels showed it darting through the sky like lightning, but for the men strapped into the cockpit, it was more like gambling with death. The He-162 had speed, no one doubted that. With its BMW 003 turbojet, it could hit nearly 560 miles per hour faster than most Allied fighters of the time. But speed isn't everything, especially when your aircraft is unstable, underbuilt, and unforgiving. The controls were twitchy to the point of being lethal. Small stick movements translated into violent rolls or dives. Inexperienced pilots, many of them teenagers, often lost control within seconds of takeoff. And the wings were death sentences. Constructed from glued wooden panels, they had a terrifying habit of simply snapping under stress. Entire jets disintegrated mid-flight, leaving nothing but fire and wreckage. One German report admitted quietly, "The aircraft is dangerous, even for experienced men." Then came the strange design choice. The engine mounted on top of the fuselage. It looked futuristic, almost elegant, but in practice, it was disastrous. The BMW engine was prone to flameouts. If debris was sucked in, or if the pilot throttled too hard, it often exploded. Mechanics recalled jets returning scorched, with fires still burning in the tail. Worse still, if the engine failed, there was little chance of survival. Positioned so high above the fuselage, it made ejection almost impossible. Pilots who bailed out were sometimes roasted by their own engine exhaust. Imagine being 16 years old, ordered to fly a jet where even your escape could kill you. Takeoff was terrifying, but landing was worse. The He-162's fragile landing gear collapsed easily, even on smooth runways. Pilots often overshot because the jet came in so fast and was difficult to slow. A single mistake meant the nose buried into the dirt, flipping the cockpit and crushing the boy inside. Luftwaffe records from early 1945 tell a chilling story. The majority of He-162 losses occurred not in combat, but on takeoff and landing. It was a machine that killed its own before it ever reached the enemy. Then, experienced Luftwaffe veterans sounded alarms. Some of Germany's most skilled test pilots called the He-162 suicidal. One ace compared flying it to balancing on a knife edge while blindfolded. Another flatly refused to fly after a near-death stall on approach. But warnings didn't matter. By 1945, Nazi leadership didn't want truth, they wanted spectacle. They wanted a propaganda symbol, a headline-grabbing wonder weapon, even if it meant sacrificing the very boys they claimed to be saving. Here's a little-known twist. German factory workers, many of them forced laborers from occupied countries, sometimes deliberately sabotaged the jets. Some glued wings with poor mixtures, others weakened bolts, knowing that their small act of rebellion might cost a Luftwaffe pilot his life. The Nazis covered up many of these incidents, blaming enemy spies or material shortages. But after the war, numerous testimonies confirmed the He-162's deadliness wasn't just poor design, it was also resistance from within. It's a haunting irony. While Germany tried to build a miracle fighter, its own oppressed workers helped ensure it would never succeed. The statistics are staggering. By the end of the war, more He-162 seconds had crashed in accidents than had ever been lost to Allied fighters. Some Luftwaffe squadrons never even saw combat. Their entire jet fleets were wiped out in training. Young pilots, sometimes still in their school uniforms, died before they had a chance to fire a single shot. For those who survived, the trauma was immense. Survivors spoke decades later of the fear, the way the cockpit shook, the smell of burning glue, the knowledge that any second could be their last. One veteran summed it up simply: the He-162 was not a fighter, it was a death trap. The He-162 wasn't just a jet, it was a symbol of Germany's desperation. And the true horror wasn't the machine itself, it was who they forced to fly it. By 1945, the Luftwaffe had bled itself dry. Its elite aces were either dead, captured, or exhausted. Fuel shortages meant even surviving veterans could barely log flight hours. So, who was left to fly the people's fighter? Hitler's answer: the Hitler Youth. Teenagers, boys who weeks earlier had been in classrooms or playgrounds, were suddenly wearing flight suits. Some were 16, others barely 15. They were given crash courses in aviation, often no more than a handful of hours in a glider, and then shoved into the cockpit of a machine that could reach 560 miles per hour. It wasn't training, it was ritual sacrifice. The propaganda machine told these boys they were Germany's saviors. Posters showed heroic young pilots defending the Reich against endless waves of American bombers. Newspapers boasted that one youth in a jet is worth 10 men in a Mustang. But behind the lies was a grim reality. Even veteran Luftwaffe instructors admitted the He-162 was barely controllable. Some refused to train boys on it, calling it outright murder. Still, orders were orders. The Reich promised medals, glory, even immortality. For many young cadets, indoctrinated since childhood, this was enough. They climbed into the cockpit and often never returned. Accounts from the time paint a chilling picture. Some Hitler youth froze in their seats, unable to move the throttle forward. Others wept openly on the runway. Officers dragged boys from cockpits, replacing them with another cadet willing to take the risk. In some squadrons, it was said that every takeoff was a coin toss. Half the boys would never make it back. One mechanic recalled, "They were children. We strapped them in, knowing the jet would likely kill them. We called them pilots, but they were really victims." Records show that in the very first training units, multiple Hitler Youth cadets died before even seeing combat. Some crashed on takeoff, others when their wings sheared mid-air. One 16-year-old reportedly survived just 3 minutes after leaving the ground before his jet broke apart. His family was told he died a hero. In truth, he was killed by the Reich's lies. This wasn't war. This was exploitation of children, dressed up as patriotism. Here's where the story turns even darker. Many German civilians despised the idea of children being sacrificed. In underground factories where He-162 seconds were built, some workers deliberately sabotaged components, weakening glue, misaligning parts, leaving bolts unfastened. To the Nazi command, this was treason. But to those forced laborers, it was resistance. Every act of sabotage might spare a young boy's life, even if it doomed the plane. The Nazis covered up many of these failures as technical issues, but decades later, survivors admitted sabotage was real and it was widespread. For those who survived even a few missions, the scars lasted a lifetime. Survivors described the He-162 as a machine that hated its pilot, always vibrating, always threatening to collapse. Many of these boys were so shaken that they refused to fly again. Some ran away. Others deliberately crashed their jets during training, hoping to fake death and escape another mission. Historians note that in the final months of the war, German commanders often punished these boys as cowards, even though the real cowardice was in Berlin, where leaders sent children to die in defective machines. The story of the He-162 is often told as a technical one about engines, wings, and design flaws, but the human story is more chilling. The Reich built a jet designed for children, then called it the future. They turned indoctrination into aviation fuel, sacrificing a generation that never had a chance to live. It wasn't just poor engineering that killed these pilots. It was ideology blind, desperate ideology that valued propaganda over life. For all its flaws, when the He-162 managed to take off, stay in one piece, and find its way into combat, it shocked Allied pilots. Imagine you're an American P-51 Mustang pilot in early 1945. You've flown dozens of missions. You know the enemy's tricks. Suddenly, a small, dart-shaped aircraft rockets past your formation, climbing at an angle no prop plane could ever match. Reports from stunned Allied airmen describe the He-162 as unnatural. Some thought it was a secret rocket. Others thought they were seeing an experimental missile. Few could believe it was a fighter. Its speed alone made it seem like a miracle machine. At over 550 miles per hour, it could leave even the fastest Allied escorts behind, at least in a straight line. When the He-162 had the rare chance to attack, it could be devastating. Its twin 20mm cannons could rip through a bomber in seconds. Allied formations had never faced jets in large numbers, and the shock factor alone was enough to rattle even experienced crews. One American recalled, "The first time we saw them, we thought, my God, if they can build hundreds of these, the war will change." But the miracle always came with a catch. Speed was useless if you couldn't stay airborne long enough to use it. The He-162 had a combat endurance of just 30 minutes. That meant pilots had to take off, climb, attack, and return almost immediately. If anything went wrong, an ambush, a mechanical failure, even bad weather, they never made it home. Worse still, the jet couldn't dogfight. Its controls were so sensitive and unpredictable that tight maneuvers often ended in disaster. Allied pilots quickly learned the trick: force the jet into a turning fight, and it would either stall, overbank, or simply tear itself apart. The P-51 Mustang became the jet's natural predator. Not because it was faster, it wasn't, but because the Mustang had endurance and tactics. American squadrons developed a ruthless strategy. Let the jet go on its attack run, then wait for it to return to base. With only half an hour of fuel, He-162 pilots had no choice but to land quickly. That's when Mustangs circled airfields, pouncing on jets as they slowed on approach. To Allied pilots, it was almost like hunting birds with shotguns. To German pilots, it was slaughter. There were, however, moments of terrifying success. A handful of He-162 pilots did manage to score kills against Allied fighters. In one documented case, an He-162 shot down a British Typhoon, proof that in the right conditions, the jet could bite back. But these victories were rare. For every Allied aircraft destroyed, several He-162 seconds were lost to accidents, malfunctions, or fuel starvation. By the numbers, the jet never made a dent in the Allied bombing campaign. To the Allies, the He-162 was both frightening and reassuring. Frightening because it showed just how advanced German engineering still was. Reassuring because its flaws made it useless in larger-scale combat. One American intelligence report summed it up bluntly: "If this is their miracle, we have nothing to fear." For the Germans who flew it, though, the fear never faded. Some Luftwaffe veterans admitted they'd rather face swarms of Mustangs in an old 4-190 than climb into a He-162 again. Others called it a lottery ticket. Maybe it would get you a kill. Maybe it would kill you. Meanwhile, Allied pilots saw the jet as both a threat and an opportunity. Shooting down one of Germany's futuristic machines became a badge of honor. Reports of jet kills were celebrated across squadrons, not because the jets were unbeatable, but because they symbolized Germany's last desperate hope. In the end, the He-162 was more valuable as propaganda than as a fighter. For Allied troops, it was proof of Germany's desperation. For the Reich, it was a hollow symbol, a machine paraded as the future while their cities burned and their armies crumbled. Even Germany's miracle jet couldn't escape reality. For all its futuristic design, for all its brief flashes of brilliance, the He-162 was built on sand, and by 1945, the sand was running out. By the time the He-162 entered production, Germany's industrial heart was already shattered. Allied bombers had pounded assembly plants, rail lines, and supply depots into rubble. So the Nazis turned to desperate measures. The jet was built in underground factories, in forest clearings, even in makeshift workshops manned by forced labor. Production lines ran on starvation rations, using wood because aluminum was gone, and glue so poor it couldn't hold the wings together. Officially, thousands of He-162 seconds were planned. In reality, only a few hundred ever left the assembly line, and fewer still ever flew. Even if the Reich could build jets, there was another problem: fuel. By 1945, Germany's oil reserves were almost gone. Synthetic fuel plants were bombed repeatedly. Fighter units were grounded for days, sometimes weeks, because there was nothing to put in their tanks. The He-162 may have been fast, but it guzzled fuel like no other. With only 30 minutes of endurance, it was practically useless for long patrols. Many units received jets and never flew them, because they couldn't spare a drop of fuel. In some bases, He-162 seconds sat covered in snow, untouched, while American and British fighters ruled the skies overhead. War isn't just about technology, it's about numbers. By early 1945, the Allies had over 10,000 operational fighters in Europe. Germany's jet fleet, barely a few dozen airworthy aircraft at a time. Even if every He-162 had worked perfectly, which they didn't, the math was impossible. A miracle jet couldn't win a war fought on scale. One American officer put it bluntly after the war: "They had speed, we had everything else." The Luftwaffe knew the He-162 required experienced hands, but by 1945, those hands were gone. The average German pilot had less than 20 flying hours before combat, many of them in gliders, not powered aircraft. Veteran aces who might have mastered the He-162 were either dead, injured, or flying the Me-262 instead. That left teenagers, trainees, and the desperate. The result was predictable. More pilots died in training than ever scored kills in combat. Entire squadrons were wiped out before even seeing the enemy. Internal Luftwaffe documents, some discovered after the war, admitted the truth. One report read, "Operational losses due to accidents exceed combat losses. Urgent improvements required." But there was no time for improvements. The Reich had weeks, not years. Hitler wanted a miracle now, and the jet became just another broken promise. In Berlin, propaganda still boasted of squadrons of miracle jets guarding the skies. Posters showed brave young men in cockpits, their jets blazing past helpless Mustangs. But the reality was far more tragic. Out of hundreds of He-162 produced, most never flew a single mission. Those that did were more likely to kill their own pilots than to down an enemy. The Allies knew the truth. The people's fighter was no army saver. It was an illusion, a mirage of victory. As the Reich collapsed, some German officers openly admitted the jet program was madness, a waste of resources that could have been spent building more reliable aircraft or even training ground troops. But Hitler refused to hear it. To him, the He-162 was still a symbol of Germany's invincibility, even as Soviet tanks closed in on Berlin. In his final days, Hitler reportedly demanded to know how many jets were flying. His staff lied, telling him hundreds, maybe thousands. In truth, barely a handful limped into the skies. For decades, historians, pilots, and armchair generals have asked the same question: what if Germany's miracle jets had arrived sooner? The most common legend goes like this: if the He-162 or its bigger brother, the Me-262, had entered service in 1943 instead of 1945, the Luftwaffe might have turned the skies. Allied bombers would have been shredded, invasion plans delayed, maybe even the outcome of the war changed. But here's the uncomfortable truth: technology alone doesn't win wars. Jets were fast, yes, they were revolutionary. But they couldn't fly without fuel, they couldn't fight without trained pilots, and they couldn't replace the hundreds of reliable aircraft the Allies produced every single day. In short, Germany didn't lose the war because its jets were late. It lost because it fought a world of enemies with dwindling resources and blind leadership. Another myth claims the He-162 was unbeatable in combat, too fast for Allied fighters, too advanced to counter. In reality, speed was its only advantage. Once the surprise wore off, the Allies adapted. Mustangs ambushed jets on landing. Spitfires forced them into tight turns. Bombers simply flew higher and tighter, waiting for the jet to run out of fuel. The unbeatable fighter wasn't unbeatable at all. It was fragile, short-lived, and predictable. One story, whispered for decades, was that the He-162 was deliberately doomed. That German engineers and factory workers, many of them slaves or political prisoners, had sabotaged production on purpose. We now know there's truth to that rumor. Post-war testimonies confirm it. Bolts loosened, glue watered down, parts swapped for weaker materials. Workers risked execution to slow the Nazi war machine, and in doing so, they may have saved countless young pilots from certain death. It's a haunting thought. that the true heroes of the He-162 story weren't the men in cockpits, but the unseen hands that made sure fewer boys ever got airborne. So let's ask it plainly. What if the jet had worked? Even if the He-162 had been stable, reliable, and mass-produced in time, the odds were still impossible. The Allies outproduced Germany 10-1. Their radar networks, logistics, and sheer pilot numbers dwarfed anything the Reich could field. At best, the jet might have prolonged the war, maybe delayed the bombing of Berlin, maybe slowed the Allied advance for a few months. But victory, no. The writing was already on the wall. Perhaps that's why the He-162 endures in memory. Not as a war winner, not as a true miracle, but as a symbol of desperation. It represents the paradox of Nazi Germany's war effort. Brilliant engineers building futuristic machines in a collapsing state. It shows how obsession with wonder weapons blinded leaders to reality. And it reminds us that behind every so-called miracle, there were terrified teenagers paying the price. Today, the He-162 survives in museums. Restored examples sit in hangars, their sleek lines admired by aviation enthusiasts. But look closely, and you'll see the crude woodwork, the hasty joints, the compromises of desperation. Historians argue about its legacy. Was it the dawn of the jet age, or just a cautionary tale? One thing is clear, the Allies noticed. The jet age truly began after the war, with America's F-80 Shooting Star and Britain's Meteor. But unlike the He-162, those jets were refined, tested, and flown by trained men. The Germans had given the world a glimpse of the future, but in the most tragic, self-destructive way possible. In the final months of the war, Germany unveiled its miracle fighter. Sleek, fast, futuristic, a glimpse of tomorrow, born in the ruins of today. But history remembers the He-162 not as a triumph, but as a tragedy. The Reich promised its people salvation. Propaganda films showed heroic pilots in unstoppable jets. Posters proclaimed that the people's fighter would sweep the skies clean. And yet, most He-162 seconds never fired a shot in anger. Many never even left the ground. Those that did too often killed their pilots before the enemy ever saw them. The miracle wasn't a miracle at all. It was a desperate illusion, built too late, too poorly, and with too little humanity left in it. The true price wasn't measured in wrecked aircraft or wasted fuel. It was measured in lives, in the faces of terrified teenagers pressed into cockpits, in the screams of families told their sons had died heroes, in the silence of factory workers who risked everything to sabotage a weapon they knew would only slaughter their own. The He-162 stands as one of the most chilling examples of how far a collapsing regime will go to preserve its pride. It was never about defending the skies. It was about pretending Germany still had a future, even as the Reich crumbled around them. And yet, the He-162 mattered, not for Germany, but for the world. The jet age it symbolized was real, only it belonged to the Allies. After the war, captured He-162 seconds were studied, tested, and quietly dissected. Engineers in America and Britain examined its flaws, its innovations, and its reckless daring. From those lessons came the next generation. Aircraft, like the Shooting Star, the Meteor, and the Sabre. True jet fighters, reliable, tested, and flown by men who had time to master them. In this way, the He-162 was both a failure and a prophecy. But perhaps the most haunting lesson is this: technology without truth is worthless. You can build the fastest jet in the world, but if it's flown by boys with 10 hours of training, it's nothing but a death trap. You can craft the most advanced engine, but if you have no fuel to feed it, it's nothing but a museum piece. War is not won by miracles. It's won by endurance, logistics, training, and will. Germany forgot that, And so its miracle jet became a symbol not of power, but of desperation. So picture it. Spring 1945, a snow-dusted runway in northern Germany. A small wooden jet, its wings glued together in a factory deep underground, rattles to life. Inside the cockpit, a boy barely 17 grips the stick, hands shaking. His instructors shout at him to go. He throttles forward. The jet roars down the runway, lifts into the air, and then vanishes into smoke. A wing has snapped. The boy never had a chance. This was the true story of the people's fighter, a miracle jet that killed more Germans than it ever killed enemies.